You're a bottleneck, Margot. A relic. That's what the new 3-3-year-old VP told me right before he terminated my contract to streamline the budget. He thought he was just firing an expensive older employee. He didn't realize he was actually evicting the landlord of his own digital infrastructure. He signed my liability waiver with a smug grin, thinking he'd won. He had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, his innovation would freeze emergency rooms across Chicago, and legal would be begging me to pick up the phone. Before I reveal how a single signature cost them $50 million, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had a boss who confused experience with expiration, hit that subscribe button. You're going to enjoy this. My name is Margot Karras, and I am not a person who enjoys chaos. For 22 years, I served as the chief systems architect for OmniScript Health, a massive medical data conglomerate based in Chicago. I am 54 years old, and I have spent my entire career building order out of entropy. When I started at this company, it was nothing more than 3 pharmacists operating out of a damp basement, tracking prescriptions on Excel spreadsheets that crashed every time the file size exceeded 10 megabytes. I was the one who came in and laid the digital foundation. I wrote the Karras Core, the proprietary architectural engine that now securely processes over 4 million patient records a day. I built the firewalls that keep Russian ransomware gangs out of our database. I designed the redundancy protocols that ensure a surgeon in the emergency room never has to wait more than 0.3 seconds to see a patient's blood type. For 2 decades, I was the invisible structural engineer of this company's success. I was the reason everything worked. And because everything worked so perfectly, nobody ever noticed me. Silence was my signature. But silence, it seems, is easily mistaken for obsolescence by men who measure value solely by the volume of their own voices. That was the mistake made by Silas Thorne. Silas was our newly appointed Vice President of Strategic Innovation, a 33-year-old man who wore Italian suits that were too tight across the shoulders and spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords he had learned from LinkedIn articles. He arrived at OmniScript with a mandate to disrupt our internal culture, a directive he interpreted as destroying anything he didn't immediately understand. He viewed my rigorous safety protocols not as essential protection, but as bureaucratic friction. To him, I wasn't the guardian of the vault. I was the old woman standing in the way of his sprint toward a quarterly bonus. The conflict began on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of Chicago day where the wind rattles the glass of the skyscrapers. I was at my workstation, conducting a routine audit of our encryption keys, when Silas entered my office without knocking. Trailing behind him like a nervous shadow was Benji, a 22-year-old junior developer who had been with us for less than a fiscal quarter. Benji was a nice enough kid, but he treated coding like a video game. Fast, messy, and focused entirely on the front-end visuals while ignoring the structural back-end. Silas leaned against my doorframe, crossing his arms, and informed me that he was overriding my rejection of the fast-track login update. I turned my chair to face him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I explained, with the patience one might use to explain physics to a toddler, that the fast-track update bypassed the 2-factor authentication standard required by HIPAA federal regulations. I told him that while removing that step would indeed save doctors 15 seconds during login, it would also leave our entire database vulnerable to credential stuffing attacks. Silas didn't listen. He waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. He told me that my thinking was legacy. He used that word like a slur. He said the market demanded velocity, not paranoia, and that my insistence on regulatory compliance was stifling the agile workflow he was trying to implement. He then turned to Benji and ordered the boy to deploy the code immediately, bypassing my administrative block. I looked at Benji. The boy's eyes were wide, darting between the VP and me. He knew, technically, that I was right. But he also knew who signed his timesheets. With a trembling hand, Benji typed the override command into his laptop. I didn't stop him. I didn't raise my voice or threaten to call HR. I simply watched the terminal on my screen flash green as the security layer was stripped away. In that moment, I realized that arguing with Silas was like trying to explain the concept of drowning to a fish. He wouldn't understand until he was gasping for air. So, I did the only logical thing. I opened my private log file and documented the event. Executive override invoked by Silas Thorne. Security Protocol 4, a disabled. Liability shifted. I saved the file, took a sip of my lukewarm tea, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, the calendar invitation appeared in my inbox. Department All Hands. Strategic Realignment. It was a Zoom webinar link. When I joined, I saw nearly 200 faces from the IT and engineering departments populate the grid. Silas sat at the head of the boardroom table, broadcasting in high definition. He looked energized, practically vibrating with the thrill of his own power. He began the meeting with a 20-minute monologue about the need for fresh blood and digital natives to lead the company into the future. He spoke about shedding the heavy skin of the past. And then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he announced the restructuring. He didn't just fire me, he made a spectacle of it. He declared that the role of Chief Systems Architect was being dissolved to flatten the organization and promote rapid iteration. He named Benji as the new lead of Systems Agility. Then, he looked directly into the camera lens, looking directly at me, and said that Margot Karras would be transitioning out of the company, effective immediately. The chat box on the side of the Zoom screen remained frozen. No one typed a goodbye. No one typed a protest. The fear was palpable even through the internet connection. These were engineers who knew exactly how much load I carried, but they also had mortgages and student loans. I didn't blame them for their silence. I simply unmuted my microphone for one brief second. "Understood," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the emotion Silas was undoubtedly hoping to provoke. I didn't give him tears. I didn't give him anger. I gave him nothing but professional compliance. 10 minutes later, Silas was standing at my desk with a cardboard box and a security guard. He wanted to ensure I didn't steal company property. The irony was almost suffocating. He demanded my badge, my keys, and the administrative passwords to the mainframe. I stood up, smoothing the creases in my skirt. I reached into my locked drawer and pulled out a document I had drafted 15 years ago. The original intellectual property rider from my very first contract with OmniScript, back when they were too poor to pay me a full salary and instead agreed to let me retain ownership of the core code I developed. The document clearly stated that OmniScript held a usage license for the Karras core, contingent upon my continued employment or a paid monthly retainer. By firing me, he was effectively canceling that license. But I didn't explain that part to him. Not yet. I simply placed a standard termination of responsibility waiver in front of him. "I need you to sign this," I said quietly. "It formally acknowledges that as of 11 a.m. today, Margot Karras is no longer responsible for the integrity, security, or uptime of the OmniScript network. Once you sign this, the system is entirely yours." Silas barely glanced at the paper. He was too busy gloating, too busy enjoying the sight of the office matriarch being dethroned. He snatched the pen from my hand, scrawled his signature across the bottom line, and shoved it back at me. "Happy now?" he sneered. "Now give me the passwords and get out. We have a future to build." I handed him a sticky note with the root credentials. I placed my ceramic mug and a photo of my prize-winning rose garden into the cardboard box. I looked at the server room one last time. The blinking blue lights of the racks I had installed with my own hands. The hum of the cooling fans that sounded like a heartbeat. I felt a strange pang of sadness, not for myself, but for the machine. It was about to be orphaned. I walked past Benji, who refused to make eye contact with me, and headed for the elevators. As the doors closed, shutting out the world of OmniScript, I pulled out my phone. I opened the admin app for my private consulting firm, Karras Logic LLC. I navigated to the Client Licenses tab. There was OmniScript Health, listed as active. I tapped the Edit button. I changed the status to License Terminated, Vendor Exit. A warning popped up on my phone screen. Action will initiate 72-hour grace period, followed by system lockdown. Proceed? I didn't hesitate. I pressed Confirm. I wasn't hacking the system. I wasn't planting a virus or a logic bomb. I was simply following the strict letter of the contract that Silas had just unknowingly voided. The software was programmed to check for a valid vendor certificate every 3 days. Without me there to authenticate it, the certificate would expire. When it expired, the Karras core would assume the system had been stolen or compromised, and it would do exactly what a high-security medical database is designed to do. It would lock the doors, swallow the keys, and encrypt the data to protect the patients. The clock started ticking at 11:15 a.m. on Thursday. They had 72 hours. The next 3 days were the most peaceful of my life. While OmniScript was undoubtedly celebrating my departure, I went home and slept for 12 hours straight. I woke up on Friday morning and spent the entire day in my garden. I pruned the hydrangeas. I fertilized the soil. I drank tea on my porch and listened to the wind in the trees, a sound so different from the constant drone of server fans. I deliberately did not check the news. I did not check LinkedIn. I disconnected completely. It was a detoxification. Meanwhile, inside the office, I knew exactly what was happening. With the security layers stripped away by Benji's new update, the system would be flying. It would be faster than ever. The doctors would be praising the speed. Silas would be walking around the office like a conquering hero, telling the board of directors that firing me was the best decision they ever made. They were experiencing the exhilarating rush of freefall, mistaking it for flying. They didn't realize the ground was rushing up to meet them. Saturday passed. Then Sunday. The 72-hour grace period was ticking down, second by silent second. I imagined the server logs filling up with certificate renewal, warning messages, yellow flags that Benji was likely ignoring because he didn't understand what they meant, or because he had muted the notifications to avoid annoying Silas. Ignorance is bliss until it becomes negligence. Monday morning arrived. The deadline was 11:15 a.m. I was in my kitchen, baking a loaf of sourdough bread. The smell of yeast and warm flour filled the house. I checked the clock on the microwave. 11:14 a.m. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. 11:15 a.m. It happened instantly. I didn't need to be there to see it. I knew the code better than I knew my own reflection. At that exact second, the Keras core made its scheduled call to verify the vendor license. It received a null response. Immediately, the failsafe protocol kicked in. In operating rooms, pharmacies, and insurance offices across the state, the screens didn't just freeze, they went black. Then, a single message appeared in stark white text. Critical error. Vendor license expired. System lockdown initiated. Data encrypted for protection. The chaos would have been instantaneous. I imagined the scene at headquarters. Phones beginning to ring, first one, then 10, then hundreds. A cacophony of panic. Surgeons unable to access MRI scans. Pharmacists unable to verify dosages. The entire logistical backbone of a billion-dollar company snapped in half in a microsecond. Silas would be running out of his office, his face red, screaming at Benji. Benji would be frantically typing on his keyboard, trying to restart the servers, trying to bypass the error. But every time he tried to force entry, the encryption would only deepen. It was a Chinese finger trap. The harder they struggled, the tighter it held. My personal cell phone began to buzz at 11:30 a.m. It vibrated across the marble countertop. A harsh, demanding sound. I glanced at the screen. It was the OmniScript main switchboard. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By 11:45 a.m., the calls were coming from personal numbers. I recognized some of them: senior engineers, project managers, people who had stayed silent during my firing. I didn't pick up. I wasn't being cruel. I was being legally prudent. I was no longer an employee. Answering technical questions could be construed as working without a contract, and I was done giving them free labor. At 12:15 p.m., the phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Silas. He was calling from his mobile. I let it ring 4 times before I slid my finger across the screen to answer. I put the phone to my ear but didn't say a word. I just listened to his breathing. It was ragged, panicked, the sound of a man who was watching his career burn to ash. Margot? His voice cracked. Margot, are you there? Hello, Silas, I said. My voice was calm, warm even. To what do I owe the pleasure? I thought we had said our goodbyes. Turn it back on, he barked, trying to summon authority he no longer possessed. I don't know what kind of logic bomb you planted, but this is illegal. We have patients waiting. Turn it back on right now, or I swear to God I will have the police at your door in 20 minutes. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Silas, I said, I suggest you lower your voice. You are speaking to an external vendor, not a subordinate. And regarding your threats, I didn't plant a bomb. The system is protecting itself. You fired the license holder. You signed the waiver acknowledging that I am not responsible for maintenance. The system checked for a valid admin, found none, and locked the vault. It is functioning exactly as I designed it to function, which, I might add, was documented in the architecture manuals you never read. I don't care about the manuals, he screamed. Fix it, just fix it. How much? You want overtime pay? Fine. I'll authorize triple time. Just come in and type in the code. I'm afraid it's not that simple, I replied. You see, since my employment contract was terminated, the enterprise license for the Keras Core has been revoked. OmniScript is currently using pirated software to manage medical data. That's a federal offense, Silas. If I were to come in and fix it without a new contract, I would be complicit in your illegal activity. There was a silence on the line. A long, heavy, terrifying silence. A new contract? He whispered. Yes, I said. But my rates have changed. I am no longer a salaried employee. I am a specialized consultant, and my consulting fee for emergency system restoration is quite significant. You're extorting us, he hissed. No, Silas, I'm negotiating. That's capitalism. Isn't that what you preached in your town hall? The survival of the fittest? I could hear him hyperventilating. I can't authorize a new contract. Legal has to do it. The CEO has to do it. Then I suggest you hang up and call them, I said. Because every minute the system is down, the encryption algorithm rotates the key. In about 4 hours, the data won't just be locked, it will be mathematically unrecoverable. You're on the clock, Silas. Again. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. I walked over to the oven and checked my bread. It was rising perfectly. The house smelled of warmth and comfort. Outside, the world of OmniScript was collapsing. Lawyers were likely screaming at each other, and board members were realizing that their cost-saving measure was about to cost them more than they had saved in a decade. I sat down at my kitchen table and waited for the next call. This one wouldn't be from Silas. It would be from the people who actually signed the checks. And I was ready for them. The silence that settled over my kitchen after I disconnected the call with Silas Thorne was not an empty void. It was a heavy, pregnant stillness, comparable to the atmospheric pressure drop just before a tornado touches down. I placed my mobile phone face down on the cool marble of the countertop, positioning it precisely parallel to the edge, a small gesture of order in a world that was rapidly descending into chaos. Beside it, the loaf of sourdough bread I had removed from the oven 20 minutes prior was beginning to cool, filling the room with the warm, domestic scent of yeast and caramelized crust. This aroma stood in a sharp, almost ironic contrast to the digital inferno I knew was currently consuming the headquarters of OmniScript Health. I did not feel the rush of adrenaline that usually accompanies conflict. Nor did I feel the spike of vindication one might expect after hearing a nemesis beg for mercy. Instead, I felt the cool, detached satisfaction of a structural engineer who watches a bridge withstand a hurricane exactly as the calculations predicted. I knew precisely what was transpiring on the other side of the city. I could envision Silas staring at his phone, the color draining from his face, his hands trembling as the realization washed over him. His threats of police intervention were as hollow as his understanding of the system architecture. He was a man who had brought a plastic knife to a war involving nuclear deterrence, and he had just realized the launch codes had already been entered. While I buttered a slice of warm bread, deliberately moving with slow, measured gestures to maintain my own internal rhythm, the true machinery of OmniScript Health began to grind into motion. It was not the server banks that were reacting. Those were dead, locked in their encrypted stasis, humming with the stubborn refusal of a bank vault. It was the human machinery that was finally waking up, specifically, the Department of Legal Affairs. I knew Loretta Vance, the general counsel for OmniScript, very well. She was a woman who terrified board members and junior associates alike, a 60-year-old legal shark who wore tailored gray suits that looked like armor, and possessed a mind that functioned like a steel trap. She had not been invited to the meeting where I was fired, which was Silas's first strategic error. His second, and far more fatal mistake, was assuming that the contracts I had signed 20 years ago, back when the company was a chaotic startup operating out of a damp garage, were standard boilerplate agreements that could be ignored. I learned later, through the clandestine network of loyal engineers who still whispered my name in the break rooms and via encrypted message apps, exactly how the scene unfolded in the executive wing. Loretta had stormed into the IT department, the sharp staccato of her heels cutting through the panic of the junior staff like gunfire. She found Silas in his glass-walled office, pale and sweating, still clutching his phone as if hoping it would ring back with a magical solution. She didn't ask him what was wrong. She didn't ask why the hospital network was down or why surgeons in 3 states were screaming at their monitors about missing allergy data. She simply walked past him, ignoring his stammering attempts at an explanation, and opened the physical filing cabinet, where the executive employment records and foundational charters were strictly guarded. She pulled out a thick, dust-coated binder labeled Karis Margot Founding Documents, 2004. She threw the heavy binder onto the conference table with a thud that silenced the entire room, creating a vacuum of sound where only the hum of the air conditioning remained. Silas tried to speak, tried to bluster about insubordination and sabotage, claiming I had hacked the mainframe from my kitchen. Loretta didn't even look at him. She held up a single, manicured hand to silence him, a gesture of absolute authority that brooked no argument. She began to read. She didn't read loud enough for the whole office to hear, just loud enough for Silas to understand that his career was ending in real time. She turned to page 42, the intellectual property rider, clause 19b. This was the clause I had negotiated when the company was broke and couldn't afford to pay me a market-rate salary. In exchange for lower pay in those early lean years, I had retained the copyright to the source code of the Karis core engine. OmniScript Health was granted a perpetual, non-exclusive license to use the software, contingent upon one specific, non-negotiable condition: my continued employment as the chief systems architect. Loretta looked up from the document, her eyes cold behind her rimless glasses, scrutinizing Silas as if he were a smudge on a perfectly drafted legal brief. She explained the reality of the situation to him with brutal, surgical clarity. She told him that by firing me without cause and without a renegotiated transfer of rights, he hadn't just removed an employee, he had effectively evicted the company from its own digital building. The software that ran the hospitals, the code that managed the prescriptions, the security layers that protected millions of patient identities, none of it belonged to OmniScript. It belonged to Karis Logic LLC. And because Silas had severed the employment relationship, the company was now legally operating pirated software on a massive scale, processing sensitive medical data without a valid license. This was not just a technical failure, it was a federal crime waiting to be prosecuted. The penalties for HIPAA violations are calculated per record, per violation. With 4 million active patient files, the potential fines were not just expensive, they were existential. The company would be bankrupt by the end of the fiscal quarter. Loretta closed the binder with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. She didn't scream. She didn't yell. She simply told him that he had created a liability that exceeded the total market value of the company's assets. She ordered him to sit down and be quiet, treating him like an unruly toddler, and then she picked up the phone to call the only person who had the authority to write a check large enough to fix a mistake of this magnitude: Sterling, the chief executive officer. At my home, the afternoon rain had begun to fall. A steady, rhythmic drumming against the kitchen window that blurred the view of the garden into a watercolor of greens and grays. It was a soothing sound, a natural counterpoint to the digital storm raging across the city. I poured myself a second cup of tea and moved to the living room. I picked up a novel I had been meaning to read for 6 months, though I admit to reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. I was waiting. I knew the rhythm of corporate crisis management intimately. They wouldn't call immediately. They would need time to argue, time to blame each other, time to run the financial models, and time to frantically search for an alternative solution. They would ask Benji if he could reverse engineer the code in an hour. They would ask the expensive external IT firm if they could crack the encryption with brute force. And one by one, every door would slam in their faces. My code was not complicated, but it was robust. It was built on a foundation of proprietary logic that didn't exist in any textbook or GitHub repository. Without the encryption key, which existed only in my head and on a secure offline drive, the data was as good as gone. At 3:45 p.m., a black sedan pulled into my driveway. It was not a police car, nor was it a lawyer's courier service. It was a Mercedes-Benz S-Class with tinted windows, the kind that idles silently and costs more than most people's homes. I watched from the gap in the living room curtains as the driver stepped out, opened a large black umbrella, and opened the rear door. Sterling stepped out into the rain. He was a man who usually only appeared in Forbes magazine profiles or at shareholder galas, wearing bespoke tuxedos and holding a glass of champagne. Today, he looked older than his photos. His shoulders were slumped, his tie was loosened, and he wasn't wearing his usual trench coat. He didn't march to my door with the stride of a titan of industry. He walked with the hesitant, heavy steps of a man approaching a loaded cannon, unsure if it was about to fire. I opened the front door before he could knock. I didn't invite him inside immediately. I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance, forcing him to stand on the porch under the shelter of the overhang while the wind blew rain onto the cuffs of his expensive trousers. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and physically demonstrating that shift was a crucial part of the negotiation. He was a billionaire in a wetsuit, I was a gardener in a wool cardigan, and I held all the cards. "Margot," he said, his voice raspy, likely from hours of shouting or negotiating with panic-stricken board members. "Can we talk?" He started to apologize before I could answer. He talked about misunderstandings and rogue executives acting without board oversight. He tried to frame Silas as a lone wolf, a bad apple who had made a unilateral decision that the board would never have approved. It was a polished speech, likely rehearsed in the car ride over, designed to flatter my ego and appeal to my sense of loyalty to the company I had helped build from the ground up. He spoke of the patients, of the doctors, of the OmniScript family that I was abandoning. I let him finish. I let him expend all his corporate charm and exhaust his supply of excuses. I waited until the silence stretched out between us, uncomfortable and wet, filled only by the sound of the rain. And then, I spoke. "Sterling," I said, keeping my voice low and even, devoid of the anger he expected. "I appreciate the apology, but apologies do not decrypt server banks, and family doesn't fire family via a Zoom call while muting their microphone. I have no interest in returning to OmniScript as an employee. That bridge has been burned, and the ashes have been scattered. I am now an independent vendor, and you are a potential client asking for a rush job on critical infrastructure." I reached behind me to the hallway table and picked up a single sheet of paper that I had printed out while I was waiting. It was a consulting agreement, drafted on the letterhead of Keras Logic LLC. I handed it to him. "These are the terms," I said. "They are simple, brutal, and non-negotiable." Sterling squinted at the paper in the dim light of the storm. I watched his eyes scan the 3 bullet points. First, an immediate, non-refundable emergency consulting fee of $500,000 wired to my business account within the hour. Second, a mandatory 5-year maintenance contract for the Keras Core software, billed at 3 times my previous annual salary, with a golden parachute clause that guaranteed full payout if the contract was terminated early for any reason. And third, a public statement to the board of directors and the company shareholders acknowledging that the system failure was due to administrative error by current leadership, effectively clearing my professional reputation of any negligence or malice. He looked at the number. $500,000 for what might be 10 minutes of work. He blinked, a drop of rain dripping from his hairline onto the paper. For a moment, I saw the flash of the negotiator in his eyes. I thought he might argue. I thought he might try to haggle, to offer stock options instead of cash, or vague promises of future bonuses. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket, a harsh, vibrating reminder of reality. He glanced at it. It was likely an update from the hospitals, perhaps a report of a patient being turned away from surgery because their records were inaccessible, or news that the press had gotten wind of the outage. The reality of the leverage pressed down on him like gravity. He realized that every minute he spent arguing was costing the company millions in reputation damage and potential lawsuits. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a gold fountain pen, and used the siding of my house as a desk to sign the document. The ink bled slightly in the damp air. He photographed the signed page with his phone and dialed a number. He didn't text, he called. "Authorize the wire," he said into the phone, his voice flat. "Yes, the full amount. Override the daily limit. I am authorizing it verbally. Do it now." "It's done," he said, capping the pen and looking at me with weary eyes. "The wire is initiated. You'll see it in moments." We stood there in silence for 10 minutes. It was the most expensive silence in the history of the company. I didn't move. I didn't offer him a towel. I waited until my phone pinged with a notification from my bank app. I checked the screen. The wire transfer had cleared. $500,000. Liquid. Real. Irreversible. I nodded to him and stepped back, opening the door wide. "Come in, Sterling." We walked into my kitchen. The warmth of the oven still lingered, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. I pulled out a chair at the small wooden table where I usually ate breakfast and opened my laptop, which was sitting next to the flour and the butter. Sterling stood behind me, breathless, leaning over my shoulder. He expected me to launch a complex coding interface, a black screen with cascading green text like something out of a spy movie. He expected me to type furious streams of Unix commands to battle the machine in a cinematic display of hacking prowess. He wanted to see the sweat and the effort that justified the $500,000 check he had just authorized. I did none of that. I simply opened the administrative portal for the Keras core, a clean, web-based interface I had designed for ease of use. I navigated to the License Management tab. The status light blinked a furious red. Expired. I clicked Update License. I entered the new contract number he had just generated. Then, I typed in a 16-character alphanumeric key, a master override code that I had kept memorized for 20 years, a sequence of characters that represented the DNA of the system. I pressed the Enter key. One single keystroke. A small progress bar appeared on the screen. It filled with green from left to right in less than 3 seconds. A message popped up. License validated. Decryption in progress. System restoring. Reconnecting nodes 1 through 400. On the dashboard, the red lights began to flip to green, one by one, then in rapid cascades. The server load graphs spiked as data began to flow again. The heart of OmniScript Health started beating. "That's it?" Sterling asked, his voice barely a whisper. He sounded stunned, perhaps even a little offended by the banality of the solution. "That's what I just paid for? One password? 10 seconds of typing?" I turned in my chair to face him, closing the laptop lid with a soft click. I looked him dead in the eye. "You didn't pay for the keystroke, Sterling. You paid for the 22 years of architecture that allowed that password to exist. You paid for the foresight to build a system that protects itself when its guardians are removed. You paid for the insurance that keeps your hospitals running when your VPs are incompetent. And most importantly, you paid for the lesson." He stared at me for a long moment, the realization settling in his features. He looked at the closed laptop, then at the bread on the counter, then back at me. Slowly, he nodded. He understood. In the world of high-level business, you don't pay for the effort, you pay for the result. And I had just delivered the only result that mattered. Survival. "Thank you, Margot," he said. It was the first honest thing he had said all day. He turned and walked out of my kitchen, back into the rain, back to his black car, leaving wet footprints on my hardwood floor. The aftermath was swift, surgical, and absolute. By the time Sterling got back to the office, the screens in the hospitals were flickering back to life. Patient records were populating. The backlog of prescriptions began to process. The crisis evaporated as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind only the smell of burnt careers. Silas Thorne was removed from the building before the end of the business day. He wasn't just fired, he was erased. Security escorted him out the back entrance to avoid the glare of the employees he had nearly doomed. His biography was scrubbed from the company website within the hour. His email was deactivated and his company car was repossessed. Rumor had it that OmniScript was preparing a civil lawsuit against him for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty to recoup the cost of my consulting fee. He would never work in executive leadership in the healthcare industry again. He was branded with the scarlet letter of incompetence. As for Benji, the junior developer who had been Silas's instrument, he was spared the axe but stripped of his inflated title. He was moved back to entry-level support, answering phones and resetting passwords. It was a mercy, really. He would spend the next few years actually learning how the systems worked from the bottom up before he was ever allowed to touch a command line again. He would learn the hard way, just as I had, that shortcuts are just disguised dead ends. I did not return to the office. I had no need to, and frankly, no desire to. My new contract specified that all my work would be done remotely, on my own schedule, with quarterly reviews conducted via email. I was now the highest paid consultant on the payroll, earning more in a month than I used to earn in a year, and I answered to no one but the CEO himself. The following Monday, the sun was shining. I sat on my patio with a fresh cup of tea and a notebook. The garden was in full bloom, the roses vibrant against the deep green of the leaves, drinking in the light. My laptop was open on the patio table, displaying the dashboard of the OmniScript network. Green lights across the board. Stable. Secure. Owned. I took a sip of tea and watched a bee land on a flower, collecting pollen with methodical precision. I thought about the nature of power in the corporate world. Men like Silas thought power was noise. They thought it was shouting in meetings, using aggressive hand gestures, and demanding instant obedience. They thought it was the ability to break things, to show strength. But he was wrong. True power is not about breaking things. True power is about being the only one who knows how to put them back together. It is about quiet competence. It is about reading the fine print that others ignore. And ultimately, it is about being the one holding the keys when the doors slam shut. I closed my laptop. The work was done. The system was safe. And for the first time in 20 years, I didn't have to worry about someone looking over my shoulder, questioning my methods, or threatening my livelihood. I had compliance. I had silence. And most of all, as I looked out over the empire of flowers I had built with my own hands, I finally had peace. In a corporate world that worships the loudest voice in the room, I proved that true power lies in being the one who holds the keys. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a strategy. It was the quiet confidence of knowing exactly what I brought to the table and exactly what happened when I took it away. If you have ever felt undervalued, or if you have ever had to quietly pack your box and let the bridge burn behind you, know this: you are not alone. If my story spoke to you, please leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own value. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting them see what life looks like without you.